Well, I won't go into a huge amount of detail about it because anyone who wants it. So I was very surprised to see here tonight a reprint of an article of mine that hasn't appeared yet, which will be perhaps in the 30th of August remnant, called After the Consecration. And it deals specifically with this important subject: has Archbishop Lefebvre been excommunicated? Now, I wrote to 3 canon lawyers about this, and I studied very carefully some essays written by other canon lawyers on the same subject. So the 3 others, so that was 5, the opinions of 5 canon lawyers. 4 were that he hasn't been excommunicated, 1 was that he has been excommunicated. Now, under the new Code of Canon Law, first of all, to incur excommunication, you have to be guilty of subjective mortal sin, which means, of course, that you must be aware that what you're doing is sufficiently evil to send you to hell if you die before repenting, that you must intend to commit this act knowing how serious it is. Now, I'm sure when Archbishop Lefebvre carried out the consecrations, he didn't believe that that was happening, in which case he couldn't be excommunicated. Secondly, in Canon 1323 of the new Code of Canon Law, in paragraph 4, it says you do not incur any penalty, which includes excommunication, if you believe there is a case of necessity. And that is generally the case with any law. If anyone breaks any law, civil or ecclesiastical, for a very good reason, even if you incur a civil penalty, you would be morally inculpable. You wouldn't have committed a sin. So, for example, it's wrong to steal. But if there was a father of a family whose children were starving because they had no food and he had no money, and the only way he could get them food was to steal, then he would be entitled to disregard the law against stealing. He wouldn't be committing a sin. He might still be committing a civil offence, but he wouldn't be committing any sin. Archbishop Lefebvre felt that for the good of the Church, the continuation of his society, he needed to consecrate 4 bishops on June the 30th. So happens I don't agree with him. I think he would have been much, much wiser to accept the Pope's offer and consecrate one on the 15th of August. That would have been an almost literally a heavenly way to end the marrying year. And some people, by the way, say he wasn't actually given a definite date. If you get the 15th of August remnant, which is there, you can see all the letters guaranteeing him a definite date for one bishop on August the 15th. And on that day and since, I keep thinking wistfully, if we'd seen a scene similar to the one we saw on the 30th of June on our television screens, if throughout the world we've seen Archbishop Lefebvre consecrating a bishop with the Pope's permission, his suspension lifted, the society recognised, all the society chapels becoming official, permission for all the 1962 books to be used, I just keep thinking, what might people like Rembert Weekland have felt like that day? I think he might have choked on his jelly babies, to which I understand he is addicted. My hope, I might feel this way because perhaps I'm basically malicious, which is rotten sometimes when I think perhaps if people like Weekland are sincere and I'm malicious, I could end up in hell and they could end up in heaven, which is a bit depressing. But I was thinking of my own Cardinal Hume, since there's no one from Britain here, no one will ever know I've said this. I just can only think of him as what you call as a creep over here. He's a real creep. He's not even a modernist. If he was a modernist and had some heretical principles, I might respect him. But I just consider him a kind of creep. And we have a very tall tower on Westminster Cathedral. And I thought that if on his television he had seen this consecration happening, he might have gone straight to the top of this tower and jumped off and landed on the floor without time to repent. But anyway, that hasn't happened. So let's say then that I was talking about kind of 1323 paragraph 4, which says if a case of necessity exists, you don't incur a penalty. Right, let's for the sake of argument say a case of necessity didn't exist. Does that mean he's excommunicated? Not at all under the new Code of Canon Law. And believe it or not, what I'm going to tell you now is absolutely true. In the same canon, Canon 1323, paragraph 7, It says, even if a case of necessity doesn't exist objectively, if you sincerely believe it does, then you're not excommunicated. So it's what we say in England, a case of heads I win, tails you lose. Because paragraph 4, if there is necessity, you're not excommunicated. Paragraph 7, if you think there's necessity, you're not excommunicated. And 4 out of the 5 canonists whose opinions I've studied all say that definitely he can't be said to be excommunicated. Even liberal canonists in England, by the way, who have been asked to act to comment in the Catholic papers, have said under no circumstances could any lay people who support the society ever be considered to be excommunicated. If you're going to be, by the way, your name has to be published.
What?
Even if you incur what's called a latae sententiae excommunication, which the Archbishop did, there are certain offences which if you commit them, you're excommunicated automatically. The excommunication has to be published. And you don't have to sort of treat the person as excommunicated until it's been published. And so a decree was published announcing that Archbishop Lefebvre, Bishop de Castelmayor, and those 4 other bishops were excommunicated. That decree didn't excommunicate them. They'd excommunicated themselves. But it announced to the world that they had been. It's possible they might excommunicate the priests in the society, but they'll never start going around publishing decrees of excommunication on lay people. And as I said, all the canon lawyers I've seen think it's virtually impossible that a lay person could ever be excommunicated. So another lady asked me earlier, to save her asking now, she said, what about going to Mass at chapels of St. Pius X, Archbishop Lefebvre's chapels? Well, now, as a layman, I never give people advice on things involving spiritual matters. That's something you have to get from your spiritual director. And like I said, in my own case, I haven't had any compunction continuing to go. In the chapels in London and a good many places, the attendance has gone up dramatically. People who were only going about once a month before go every week now. I think in our country it's mainly due to Cardinal Hume, who I mentioned before, who appeared on the television looking rather like Uriah Heep, if you know Charles Dickens' character Uriah Heep. And he discovered a person, this person, I don't think he knew anything about him before because Cardinal Hume was a very ecumenical prelate. But he's been engaged in ecumenical discussions for the last 20 years with Protestants. He's never mentioned this person, but this is a person called the Pope. And he's discovered about this person called the Pope. And all Catholics have to be loyal to him. And if you're not in communion with him, you're not a Catholic. So, as he hasn't mentioned this person called the Pope for 20 years, I think so many people were so disgusted at what they felt was his hypocrisy. They all started going to the Pius X chapel, even though they hadn't been going before. And I know quite a few places where the attendance has gone up quite dramatically. Now, suppose, let's presume for the sake of argument, that really the arguments I put out in this reprint, which you can get, are wrong, that he is genuinely excommunicated. Suppose we conclude that he's in schism. That will be the next exciting installment in this series of articles I shall be writing, will be is he in schism, or schism, whichever you prefer. On the 30th of June I was asked to do a programme on the Irish radio. They phoned me up about 7 o'clock in the morning and wanted some comments. I said, do you want me to say schism, schism, and schism? They said, sure, on this radio, say anything you like. And he said, what's the weather like here in London today? Anyway, let's assume he's excommunicated and in schism. Does that mean under no circumstances could you go to a society chapel? Well, again, let's get back to this new code of canon law, which I find absolutely appalling. But it just happens that it helps traditionalists. I think the liberals made this new canon law so permissive for their own benefits, it's just almost impossible to excommunicate anyone under this new code of canon law. Because it did, most people, even someone like Charles Curran, there's a very good Monsignor McCarthy who teaches in Rome, wrote a comment on Charles Curran. He called him a pornologian. He's the high priest of pornology. And he suggests it's all right for you to do things that most normal people never imagined anyone would ever think of doing. But I presume when he says so, he sincerely thinks it'd be jolly good fun to do, and we'd all be better people for it. And he probably couldn't get excommunicated under this new code. But leave aside the question of excommunication, right? We'll presume Archbishop Lefebvre is excommunicated, Archbishop Lefebvre is in schism, all the society priests are in schism. Could you then go to their chapels? Well, there's a code, Canon 844 in the new code of Canon Law. When I was told about this, I didn't believe it. I said, even now, nobody could put that in, but it's there. If you have a physical or moral difficulty in attending Mass in a church of your own right, which first is the Roman Rite Church, you can go to any church where the priest has valid orders. You can look this up for yourselves. Perhaps I'll make a photocopy of it, and Mr. Mack could publish a photographic reproduction in the remnant. Because if anyone just told me this, I wouldn't believe it. I didn't believe it when I was told. It's incredible. You can go to any church where the priest has valid orders. That means you can go along to a Russian Orthodox church, to a Greek Orthodox church, and fulfill your obligation and receive communion and go to confession to them. It's crazy. That's the conciliar church has got its own code of canon law. It's the only code of canon law the church has now. You can't have two codes of canon law in a church, by the way. The old code of canon law is abrogated. That's that. It's not like the Mass. It's finished. So the only code we have is the new code. And the new code says that if you have a physical or moral difficulty, you can go along to any church where the priest has valid orders. But what about this physical or moral difficulty? Well, there's a phrase in canon law called a grave inconvenience. All the priests here will have heard of that, a grave inconvenience. I believe in Latin it's called a grave incommodo. Actually, the grave inconvenience doesn't have to be terribly grave. If you lived about 5 miles from a church, you weren't obliged to go to Mass on Sunday, that was considered too far. That was presuming, I suppose, that people had to walk. But it also, as Canon 844 says, includes a moral difficulty. And I've discussed this with quite a few ordinary priests who say the new Mass and go along with all the changes, and they all confirm this is absolutely correct. If you go along to Mass in your parish church on Sundays, and what takes place there distresses you, you have no obligation to go to Mass at all. Some of you might feel a bit shocked about that, but priests will confirm it for you. That's what's called a grave inconvenience. So, if you go along there, and for instance, they have bevies of ladies distributing Holy Communion, which is absolutely forbidden under normal circumstances by the Vatican. They're called extraordinary ministers. You should hardly see one ever in the United States. If anyone wants a bit more information about that, I'll give you it in a moment. But if that annoys you, you don't have to go. If communion in the hand annoys you, you don't have to go. If the priest keeps grinning and leering at you and tries to pursue you down the aisle to molest you with a sign of peace, you don't have to go. So, what should you do? You are genuinely, and this applied, by the way, under the old code of canon law, a moral or physical reason why you feel unable to be present at Mass in your own church. Should you then not worship God at all? Well, the new code of canon law says you can. You can go to any church where a priest has valid orders, which means that even if the Archbishop is excommunicated, even if all the society priests are excommunicated, even if they're in schism, you could still go along to their chapels and fulfill your obligation, and you wouldn't be committing a sin. For that, we have to thank the liberals who drafted the new code of canon law. Well, this lady thinks that it is possible that if one embraced wholeheartedly the norms of the Second Vatican Council, that the lay people would be brought much more into the celebration of the Eucharist and could lead deepened spiritual lives, and that this would be reflected, shall we say, by more fervent communions and by more frequent attendance at confession. But I think the thing is, first of all, we have to look at the results as they are, and Vatican II now has been, finished in 1965, so it's now, we've had 23 years to absorb its fruits. Take the one you said more people will be going to confession. In some countries in Europe, there practically isn't confession anymore. In most countries, the practice has declined abysmally. In countries like Holland, it's practically died out. So, and the same with mass attendance. In practically every country, changes designed to increase mass attendance have been followed by a catastrophic decline in mass attendance. I think in your country, it's something like 30%, which out of 50 million Catholics is a lot of people not going. Some countries like Holland, it's over 90%, France is 80%, Italy, there's been a 50% decline in mass attendance in Italy. So it would seem that these changes haven't produced the effects which they're intended to produce. Now, it might, I suppose an answer here could be like every time anyone criticizes communism and points out to any apologist for communism that communism doesn't work, well, they say it's never been properly tried. And they can find some objection to any country in the world, and they say this isn't proper communism. Now, the person who upheld your point of view, a very eminent person, was Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. He's written a book, this is another book everyone should have. Gosh, I wish I got the kickback for all the books I'm recommending, but never mind. He wrote a book called The Ratzinger Report, and that's another book that everyone should have. And he analyzes the state of the church today, and his analysis is almost identical to the analysis of Archbishop Lefebvre on what has happened since the council, the state of the church since the council. There's hardly a word of difference. They agree completely. But what's Cardinal Ratzinger's solution? He says we have to go back to the blueprint, go back to Vatican II, start applying the council properly. Well, who is to say the council hasn't been applied properly in every case? But let's presume it hasn't. Suppose one had commissioned an architect to design an office block, and the office block was built and then collapsed, and one wanted to build it again. I don't think one would want to go back to the same architect, let alone use exactly the same blueprint. And he might well say, well, my blueprint wasn't followed properly. Try it again, it will work this time, but I don't think he'd find many customers. What Archbishop Lefebvre says, he says, forget the council and go back to tradition. And I think this is a very radical statement, but I think one could expunge the 16 documents of Vatican II from the life of the church, as in 1984, put them all down the memory hole, get rid of all the reforms and go back to things as they were in 1962, and I don't think anything positive would have been lost. You see, many of the points you've mentioned actually weren't taught by Vatican II. Vatican II never suggested there should be lay people administering communion, never actually suggested lay people should read any lessons. All these things came in afterwards from the commissions to implement the council. In many cases, they contradict what the council taught. For example, what did the council teach about Latin? Now, I think you mentioned the vernacular. How much vernacular did the Vatican II command should be used in the Mass? Not one word. There's not a word anywhere in any doctrine of Vatican II that says you must have one word of the Mass in the vernacular, not even the readings. It says Latin is to remain the norm in the Roman Rite, but where pastoral advantages accrue, that is what the council teaches. It says where there are pastoral advantages, some parts of the Mass, that mentions particularly the readings, could be in the vernacular. So that's a permission. Latin is the norm. A limited use of vernacular is the permission. And people like your own Archbishop Robert J. Guara, Portland in Oregon, he said no bishop would have believed you if you'd said the Latin liturgy would have vanished in a few years. He said they would have roared with laughter. Then he was very cultured, I think, because he then quoted Gilbert and Sullivan, and he mentioned wise Sir Joseph Porter, KCB, and he said during the council, like wise Sir Joseph Porter, KCB, we always voted at our party's call and we never thought of thinking for ourselves at all. And he said they would have laughed if you'd said the Latin liturgy would vanish, but then he added, but no one is laughing today. So a lot of the changes claiming to implement the council, there's not a word in the council to support them. Now, one point I'd agree with you quite correctly. When you go to a celebration of the new Mass, if it's celebrated devoutly by a good Orthodox priest, the grace available actually is exactly the same as in the Tridentine Mass as far as communion is concerned. What do you receive in Holy Communion? You receive Jesus Christ our Lord. You can't receive him any more or any less in the new Mass, the Tridentine Mass, the Ukrainian Rite, or the Ruthenian Rite. You receive Jesus Christ our Lord. What affects the amount of grace you receive is your own dispositions. If you have two little Latin tags, it's called ex opere operato, which means you get the grace because you receive our Lord. It's conditioned ex opere operantis, that's by the person who receives it. Now, you do get, as Father Schneider will tell you, as any traditional Catholic priest will tell you, you do get some very weird people turn up at Tridentine Masses. Some really weird people. Some of them, actually, their hearts are filled with hate. Mr. Matt's been getting a lot of hate mail because he said he didn't think it was a good idea that Archbishop Lefebvre consecrated 4 bishops. You could write and say, I disagree with you, Mr. Matt. The Archbishop had to do it. You don't have to write calling him a Judas and things like that. Now, someone who goes to a Tridentine Mass with a heart full of hate, I'd say they get no grace at all from receiving Holy Communion. But a very, very devout lady, some of these wonderful right-to-life people who dedicate their whole lives to saving babies from abortion, but who go in good conscience to the new Mass, they probably receive tremendous grace from Holy Communion. So the grace you receive depends on your own dispositions. Now, if it's coming to the fruits of the Mass, that's another matter. That depends to a large extent on the state of the Mass. And if I was having a Mass said for someone, I'd much prefer to have a Tridentine Mass said. But that's another matter. So you can get grace from going to a celebration of the new Mass, and no one can say you can't go. But no one in the world, the only person who says what rite of Mass you can go to is the Pope. The Pope says you can go to the new Mass, so you can go. Archbishop Lefebvre confirmed to me, he accepts anyone who goes to the new Mass fulfills their Sunday obligation. But if there's anything irreverent takes place at a Mass, we shouldn't go. So if there are dancing girls, clowns, anything like that detracts from the dignity of the Eucharist, then what is sacrilegious, and no one should be present as sacrilege. If you go to a Mass where there are altar girls, that is deliberate defiance of the Holy Father. If Archbishop Lefebvre is in schism, why aren't priests who use altar girls in schism, the bishops who allow it? I could find, if we had the time, I could find about 20 reasons for why Archbishop Weekland is in schism. Disobedience to the Pope. So one shouldn't go to any Mass where there's manifest disobedience to the Pope.